My husband drove to the same bank branch every last Friday of the month for 29 years. Not the one 3 blocks from our house on Maple Ridge Road. Not the one near his office downtown. He drove 45 minutes each way to a branch in Covington, across the county line, and he always left before I woke up. When I asked him why, he would pour himself a second cup of coffee, kiss the top of my head, and say the same thing every single time. Taking care of us, Carol. That's all you need to know. I believed him. Of course I did. Frank was a tax attorney. Numbers were his entire world. He had a system for everything: the grocery budget, the vacation fund, the quarterly reviews of our retirement portfolio. He'd print out and file in color-coded folders in the 3rd drawer of his desk. I had married a man who balanced the checkbook in pen, never pencil, because he said pencil implied uncertainty. Frank was never uncertain. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, not a Friday, which seemed wrong somehow. A stroke, the paramedic said. Fast and massive. He was making eggs when it happened. I found him on the kitchen floor with the spatula still in his hand, and the pan was still on the burner, and the eggs had burned completely black. That smell stayed in the house for days. I couldn't cook eggs for almost a year after that. Thomas flew in from Denver the next morning. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair his father used to sit in, and the similarity between them, the way they both held their coffee mugs with 2 hands, even when it wasn't cold, made my chest feel hollow in a way I couldn't name. My daughter Renee came up from Nashville with her husband, Paul. She looked like me when she was worried, jaw set, eyes scanning the room for something to fix. She brought groceries and cleaned the bathroom and reorganized my freezer, and we never once talked about what any of us were actually feeling. The funeral was on a Saturday. Half of Frank's firm came. People kept telling me he was one of the good ones, a straight shooter, a man with real integrity. I stood by the casserole table and nodded and said thank you so many times the words stopped meaning anything. 8 days after the funeral, I got a phone call from a man named Gerald Holt. He introduced himself as a senior officer at First Savings Bank in Covington. He said he was calling to express condolences, and also to let me know that my husband had held a private account at their branch for many years, and that as his wife, I would need to come in to discuss the account's status with regard to his estate. I asked him to repeat that. A private account. I drove to Covington the following Monday. Gerald Holt was a soft-spoken man in his late 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, measured politeness of someone who delivered bad news for a living. He shook my hand, offered me water, and then sat across from me with a folder on the desk between us, and he did not open it right away. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "your husband was a valued client here for nearly 3 decades. This account was held in his name alone." He paused. "I want to make sure you're prepared for what I'm about to show you." I told him I was a 63-year-old woman who had buried her husband 10 days ago. I said I could handle whatever was in that folder. He opened it. The account had been opened in 1995, the year after our daughter was born, the year Frank made partner at his firm. Over 29 years, he had made regular deposits, sometimes small, sometimes substantial. The current balance was not what stunned me. What stunned me was the withdrawal history, consistent, methodical, and over the last 6 years, escalating. Gerald turned to a second document, this one a summary of liens and secondary filings attached to our home address. I counted 4 of them. I recognized none of them. I asked him what the total exposure was. He told me. The number was $341,000. I sat very still in that chair and let the number exist in the room with me. Gerald handed me a glass of water I didn't remember him going to get. I drank it. "What I need to understand," I said, "is where that money went." He slid another sheet across the desk. Investment accounts. 8 of them, all under Frank's name only. The earliest ones had done reasonably well. The later ones, opened starting around 2017, showed consistent and significant losses. One had been completely wiped out. 2 others were nearly there. He had been making deposits into the Covington account, likely from our joint finances, and funneling money into increasingly desperate investment vehicles, trying to recover what he had already lost. He'd been doing it for 6 years. The Tuesday bank trips? I thought. No, the Friday ones. 29 years of Fridays. How much of that was recovery? And how much was the original mistake I didn't know about yet? I drove home in a silence so complete it felt physical. I parked in the driveway and sat there for 20 minutes before I went inside. Thomas was at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He looked up when I came in, and whatever he saw on my face made him close the computer. "Tell me," he said. I spread the documents out on the table the way you would spread a map when you've gotten completely lost. Thomas read through everything without speaking. He had his father's habit of pressing 2 fingers against his temple when he was concentrating. Watching him do it made me feel something I couldn't afford to feel right then, so I made tea instead and stood at the counter with my back to him until I heard him exhale. "Mom." His voice was quiet. "The retirement accounts. I know. I actually looked for those this morning. Before you got back, I was going through Dad's files to find the insurance documents, and I pulled the retirement statements. The most recent one I could find is from 2019. There's nothing after that." I turned around. "The account statements he used to print out," I said. "The ones in the color-coded folders." Thomas looked at me steadily. "The last folder has a 2019 label, but the statements inside stop at the 3rd quarter. I thought about the quarterly reviews. Frank sitting at his desk with his reading glasses on, printing, filing, sliding the drawer shut with the same neat click every time. All of it a performance, all of it for an audience of one. "We need a lawyer," Thomas said. "Not Dad's firm." I knew a woman through a neighbor of mine, Sandra Park, who had handled a complicated estate case for my neighbor's sister after a messy divorce. I called her that afternoon. She had an opening Thursday morning. Sandra Park's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, clean lines, good light, a small succulent on the windowsill that somehow made the room feel less clinical. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me 3 questions: whether my name was on any of the investment accounts, whether I had signed any loan documents in the last 10 years, and whether Frank had ever asked me to sign anything financial that I had signed without reading carefully. That last question stayed in the air longer than the others. "He was a tax attorney," I finally said. "When he put something in front of me, I signed it. I trusted him." She nodded, not unkindly. She said the word that Gerald Holt hadn't used but that I had been circling around since Monday. She said the word spousal financial concealment, and she said it was more common than people realized, and that it existed on a spectrum from negligence to intentional fraud, and that in Frank's case, based on what I'd described, it appeared to lean heavily toward the latter end of that spectrum. She said we needed to pull every document, every account, every lien, every loan, every filing. She said it would take time and money, and that the money part was going to be difficult given the state of my finances, but that there were ways forward. "Tell me what to do," I said. She told me. "I called Thomas from the parking garage. He picked up on the first ring. It's worse than we thought," I said. "But we're going to fight it." There was a pause on the other end. Then he said, "Okay." And I heard him already moving, already thinking, already pulling up spreadsheets in his mind the way his father used to do, except that Thomas's version of that skill was going to be used to undo what his father had built in the dark. Renee was a different conversation. I called her that evening. She had already driven back to Nashville, back to her life, back to the version of the world where her father had been a careful, reliable man who loved his family. I told her what I had found. I told her about Covington, about the investments, about the liens. I told her what Sandra had said. The silence on the line was different from Thomas's silence. His had been the silence of someone absorbing information and reorienting. Renee's had an edge to it. "Mom," she said finally, "Dad would never do something like this intentionally. He wasn't that kind of person. I have the documents, Renee. Documents can be misread. Maybe there's an explanation you haven't found yet. Maybe he was planning to tell you, and then the stroke. Renee. He was not a dishonest man. She said it with a firmness that told me she needed it to be true more than she needed it to be accurate. I loved my father. I'm not going to let you. I'm not asking you to stop loving him, I said. I'm asking you to look at the facts. She said she needed time. She said she would call me in a few days. She said to please not do anything drastic with the lawyers until she'd had a chance to think. She hung up. I sat at the kitchen table where Frank used to drink his coffee, and I held my phone and thought about what it means to love someone for 34 years. How love doesn't disappear when betrayal arrives. How the two things can occupy the same space at the same time without canceling each other out. I had loved Frank when he was the man who drove 45 minutes in the dark to manage his secrets. I still loved the man who had taught Thomas to fish at Lake Cumberland and danced with Renee at her wedding reception to that ridiculous song she'd chosen, the one Frank had pretended to hate and secretly practiced in the garage. Both men were real. The same man. It didn't make what he'd done any less of what it was. The next 3 months were paperwork and phone calls and a kind of fatigue that lived behind my eyes and never fully went away. Sandra filed a motion to contest 2 of the property liens on the grounds that I had not been a knowing party to the underlying loans. She contacted the investment brokers who had handled Frank's accounts and requested documentation of his activity. She found something I hadn't expected. 3 of the investment accounts had been opened using a home equity line of credit that listed me as a co-applicant. My signature was on the application. I had never signed that application. The handwriting expert Sandra retained was a retired documents examiner from the county court system. Her report was 11 pages. Her conclusion was 2 sentences. The signatures attributed to Carol Whitfield on the loan applications dated March 2018, October 2019, and February 2021 do not match the authenticated signature samples provided. It is my professional opinion that these signatures were produced by a different individual. Frank had forged my name 3 times while I was in the house, while I was making dinner and watching television and sleeping in the bed next to him, assuming that his world and mine were the same world. I read that report at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening with a cup of cold tea in front of me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Something that had been loosely held in place by the ordinary effort of getting through each day. Not grief, exactly. Something harder than grief. Something that felt, underneath the hurt, strangely like clarity. Thomas was with me when I read it. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." He looked at his hands the way he used to as a boy when he'd broken something and had to confess. A few years ago, Dad called me. He said he had an investment opportunity, a private equity thing, and he said he wanted me to put in $50,000 from our college fund for the kids. He said the returns would more than replace it before they needed it. I felt my stomach drop. Thomas looked up at me. Nicole said no. She said if it was such a sure thing, why did he need our money? We fought about it for a week. I thought she was being paranoid, being unsupportive. I was angry at her, but she held firm, and I backed out, and Dad seemed disappointed, but he dropped it. He shook his head. If Nicole hadn't held the line, I would have put that money in, Mom, and it would be gone, and I would have had no idea why. I reached across the table. She protected your family, I said. That's what matters. He nodded. But I've been thinking about it since you found the Covington account. Because when he called me, he was already losing money, wasn't he? He was trying to plug the holes, using whatever he could reach. Yes, I said. I think so. And if I'd said yes, we'd have lost it too. And we never would have known why, because Dad would have had an explanation. He always had an explanation. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Frank was a tax attorney. He understood how numbers could be arranged to tell any story you wanted to tell. He understood that most people, when presented with information by someone they trusted, accepted the framing without questioning the source. I had given him 34 years of that acceptance, I had called it love. I still called it love. But I understood now that trust and oversight are not the same thing, and that assuming they were was the most expensive mistake of my life. The court date was in September. I wore gray, which felt right, not mourning, not celebration, just the honest color of in between. Thomas sat beside me. Renee wasn't there. She had called me 6 weeks earlier, her voice different from the last time we'd spoken. Quiet, in a different way. "Mom," she said, "Paul and I were going through some things, financial things, getting organized, just routine. Okay, there's a loan on our credit report, a personal loan from 2020. We didn't take out any personal loan in 2020. I closed my eyes. "It's in both our names," she said, "Paul's and mine. And the mailing address on the application is your address, your old address, the house in Maple Ridge." Oh, Frank. The loan was for $22,000. It had been serviced automatically, withdrawn monthly from a small account Renee had opened after college that she barely checked anymore, assuming it was just bank fees. She had never noticed. She would never have noticed if she hadn't sat down with Paul and gone through everything line by line. The handwriting expert confirmed what we already knew. Renee had not signed that application. Neither had Paul. Frank had borrowed money in his daughter's name without her knowledge. The man who had walked her down the aisle. The man whose name she still carried in the middle of her own. She came to Cincinnati 3 weeks before the court date. We sat at the kitchen table that had by now become the place where all difficult truths were laid out. And she looked at the documents, and she didn't speak for a long time. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't. I called you irrational. I accused you of speaking badly about Dad because you were grieving. Renee, I needed it not to be true. I couldn't make it fit. The person I knew and the person who did this," she shook her head. "But they were the same person." "Yes," I said gently. "They were." She stayed for a week. She and Thomas and Sandra Park and I sat around that table more times than I can count, going through documents, cross-referencing accounts, building the case that would show a judge that 3 members of one family had been financially harmed by the same man, all of us in different ways, none of us with any knowledge of it. The judge was a woman named Patricia Owens, probably 60 herself, with reading glasses that she kept taking on and off throughout the proceedings. Sandra presented the case clearly, the forged signatures, the expert testimony, the pattern of concealment, the impact on 3 parties who had each trusted Frank Whitfield with pieces of their financial lives. The bank's attorney argued that as Frank's wife, I had benefited from his income and lifestyle, that the marital arrangement had served me well for decades, and that liability followed benefit. Sandra stood and in a voice that I have replayed in my head many times since said, "Benefit derived from a marriage does not constitute consent to fraud committed within that marriage. No reasonable interpretation of marital law holds that a spouse who trusted her husband with their finances, thereby consented to having her signature forged on loan documents she never saw." I was called to testify. The bank's attorney was young, sharp-suited, with the particular confidence of someone who had not yet been surprised by life. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "isn't it true you never reviewed the loan documents your husband managed?" "I trusted him to manage them," I said. "Yes. So you made an active choice not to be involved in your own finances?" "I made the choice to trust my husband's professional expertise. He was a tax attorney with 30 years of experience. I do not believe that choice constitutes consent to identity theft." He paused. He looked down at his notes. He looked back up. "But you never questioned his Friday trips to Covington?" "No, because he told me he was taking care of us, and for 29 years I had no reason to believe anything different." I paused. "I have learned since then that trust and verification are 2 separate things, and that conflating them was a mistake. But a mistake is not a crime. Forging someone's signature is." Judge Owens called a recess. Thomas and I sat on a wooden bench in the corridor. He was too anxious to sit still and kept standing and sitting back down. I was perfectly calm in the way I had learned to be calm over the past 6 months, the particular stillness of someone who has already survived the worst of it and knows that whatever comes next is navigable. "You were incredible in there," he said. "I was just telling the truth," I said. "It turns out that's the most powerful thing you can do in a room like that." After an hour, Judge Owens delivered her ruling. She found in my favor on all 3 liens. She found the loan applications to be fraudulent based on the expert testimony and the documented pattern of forgery. The liens on my home were released. The fraudulent loan in Renee and Paul's names was referred for further civil action against Frank's estate. We walked out of the courthouse into a cool September afternoon. Thomas hugged me for a long time. Renee, standing just behind him, was crying quietly. I held her too. "We won," Thomas said. I nodded, but I knew what winning actually felt like. Not triumph. Something more complicated. The relief of a weight lifted from a body that had been carrying it so long it had come to feel like ordinary life. The strange grief of realizing that the architecture of your marriage was, in part, a careful construction designed to keep you from seeing what was built underneath it. I started a new job in November, 3 weeks after the ruling. A woman named Agnes Bellamy owned a small second-hand bookshop on Fulton Street, 2 blocks from the farmers' markets. She had a sign in her window, part-time help, flexible hours, and something about the handwriting on it, slightly crooked and entirely without apology, made me walk in. Agnes was 71, white-haired, with the unguarded directness of someone who had stopped worrying about managing other people's impressions of her. She poured me coffee from a pot that had been on too long and asked me why I wanted to work in a bookstore at my age. I told her the short version. My husband died. I found out he had been hiding things. I needed to work, and I needed somewhere to go that was not my house. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "My first husband did something similar. He waited until I found out to tell me he was sorry, same as yours. The difference was he was still alive when I found out, so I got to throw a cast iron pan at him." She handed me a coffee mug. "You can start Monday." I worked at the bookstore 4 days a week. I learned the inventory, learned which regulars liked which genres, learned the rhythm of the place. Agnes and I became friends the way women of a certain age become friends quickly, with very little ceremony, built on honesty and shared coffee and the particular recognition of having been underestimated by people who should have known better. One afternoon, a woman came in, maybe 50, dressed carefully but with the look of someone holding themselves together with significant effort. She moved through the shelves without really seeing the books. I recognized it because I had done the same thing myself in the weeks after Frank died, looking without seeing. Moving to have somewhere to move. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. She looked at me. Her eyes were red around the edges. She said, "I don't know. Maybe something about." She stopped. "My husband handles all of our money," she said. "He always has." She said it like a confession. "He says I'm not good at it, that I don't need to worry about it, that he takes care of everything. But I found something last week, a statement for an account I didn't know we had. I asked him about it, and he said it was nothing, just an old account. Don't worry about it." She looked at me, "But I'm worried about it." I set down the book I was holding. "You are right to be worried," I said. "And you are not bad at money. You have been told that you are bad at money, which is a very different thing." She blinked. I spent the next 40 minutes with her at the corner table near the window, the one Agnes used for her own reading on slow mornings. I told her what questions to ask. I told her what documents to request. I told her about Sandra Park, who had by then helped 3 women I knew navigate situations of varying severity. I told her what I had learned, that love is not a reason to be kept in the dark, that transparency is a form of respect, and that the feeling she was describing, the low, persistent wrongness that she couldn't quite name, was her own intelligence trying to tell her something. She came back 2 weeks later. She had requested the statements. She had found 4 accounts she'd had no knowledge of. She had called Sandra. She brought me a plant as a thank you, a small philodendron, and I put it on the counter next to the register, and it is still there. More women came, in ones and twos, through word of mouth and Sandra's referrals, and sometimes, just because they wandered into the bookstore the way that woman had, not looking for books, looking for something else. Agnes and I started a small group that met the second Thursday of every month in the back room of the shop. Folding chairs, bad coffee, a plate of whatever Agnes had baked that week, and an hour and a half of telling the truth without apology. Some of the stories were like mine. Some were different control that showed up not in forged signatures, but in allowances and permissions and the slow erosion of a person's confidence in her own judgment. Some were still in the middle of it, afraid to act. Some had already gotten out and were learning, as I was still learning, what it meant to stand on ground that belonged only to them. I shared my story at the first meeting. All of it. The 45-minute drive to Covington. The folder of failed investments. The forged signatures. The daughter who hadn't believed me at first. And how she came back. And what it cost each of us to get to the truth. I told them about standing in the kitchen the morning Frank died and not crying, and feeling guilty about not crying, and later understanding that some part of me had already known, without knowing that it knew, that something had been wrong for a very long time. "How do you not hate him?" someone asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I do, some days," I said. "And some days I miss him so much I can't find a place to put it." He was a complicated person who made terrible choices and loved his family in the genuine way that was available to him, while still choosing to deceive us. I will probably be untangling those two things for the rest of my life, but I stopped waiting for those feelings to resolve into something simple. They aren't going to. The woman who had asked nodded slowly. She had been married for 28 years. On what would have been Frank's and my 35th anniversary, I drove back to Covington. Not to First Savings Bank, that branch had actually closed since Gerald Holt's retirement, but to a newer bank a few doors down from the old location. I went in and opened an account. Just my name, Carol Walsh, which is the name I was born with and which I had legally restored 4 months after the estate was settled, at the same courthouse where Judge Owens had handed down her ruling. The young man who helped me open the account asked if I wanted to add a joint holder. "No," I said, "just me." He typed for a moment. "And what would you like your account holder name to read?" "Carol Walsh," I said. "I would like it to read exactly that." He smiled and said he would take care of it, and I sat across from him in that small office and looked at the form with my name on it. My name, as I had been before I was anyone's wife, and I felt something that I can only describe as recognition. Like running into an old friend you had lost touch with and realizing you had missed her more than you knew. I still work at the bookstore. The group has grown to 22 members, and 3 of us have spoken to a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer who is writing about financial abuse in long-term marriages, a subject that is more common and more devastating and less discussed than almost anyone realizes. Sandra Park has become someone I would call a friend. Agnes is teaching me how to do the inventory ordering, which means she is planning to retire and is not telling me yet, but I am patient. Renee and I talk on the phone twice a week now, more than we have since she left for college. She and Paul are rebuilding their credit. She asked me recently whether I thought she would ever stop feeling angry at her father, and I told her I didn't know. I told her that what I'd learned was that anger was not a problem to be solved, just energy that needed somewhere to go, and that eventually, if you were lucky and you worked at it, you figured out how to send it somewhere useful. Thomas took his kids to Lake Cumberland last summer, the same place Frank used to take him. He sent me a photograph of the 3 of them on the dock in the early morning light. His son, holding a fishing rod with the look of intense, hopeful concentration that Thomas used to have at that age, that Frank used to have. I kept the photograph. I'm not sure where to put it yet, but I kept it. There is a line I have said more than once in that back room on Thursday evenings to women in various stages of loss and discovery and rebuilding, and I believe it more each time I say it. The person who tried to erase you was not able to finish the job. The evidence is that you are here, in this room, telling the truth. That is not a small thing. That is In fact, the whole thing. If any of what I've described sounds familiar, the feeling that something is wrong but you can't quite name it, the gentle redirection away from questions you have every right to ask, the long habit of trusting someone so completely that the thought of verifying never entered your mind. Please hear me when I say this. Your curiosity is not a betrayal of your relationship. It is your right. Look at the accounts. Ask the questions. Know your own numbers. Not because you distrust the person you love, but because you are a full partner in your own life. And full partners do not stay in the dark. I learned that lesson at 63, in a bank branch in Covington, Ohio, on a gray Monday morning with a glass of water I don't remember anyone pouring. I would have preferred to learn it sooner, but I have it now, and I am not letting go of it. And neither, I hope, will you.